And I'm very honored to be here. I'm particularly honored to be here in this discussion with Alvaro Bedoya, who indeed, unlike me, needs no introduction and is one of the people I'm most happy to have been able to interact with. So in part because one of the things that I think has been historically missing in antitrust and the way in which we've enforced is any awareness of data protection, of privacy, and that intersection. I'm so glad that there are people, deep friends like Johnny Ryan in this room, who have done so much in Europe and globally to push that conversation. But Alvaro has been certainly one of those who most deeply understands and pursues that connection. And so for me, the fact that he's a commissioner in Competition Consumer Protection Agency is very, very significant, a leading example. So I wanted to, of course, this conversation is about AI. I wanted to start with the beginning, really. Your background, Barry described your background in data protection and privacy, exposed you reasonably early on to issues that are now center stage in the discussion on AI. So how did you actually come across it, and how did you start learning from it? Let's start from the beginning.
Thank you, Cristina. First of all, let me say I'm really excited to be here with you. I want to thank Barry, everyone at Open Markets, everyone at AI Now for having me. I'm, of course, speaking just for myself, not for my colleagues or any of the staff of the Commission. Also just want to thank my team with me here today, Catherine Sanchez, Sunil Stevens, watching at home, Max Miller, and my colleagues who work on consumer protection issues, Aaron Ricky and Danielle Estrada. All of their thinking has helped me better understand all of this. So yes, I am. Now, there's a number of folks in the room who've been doing this AI stuff for a while, for longer than a year at least. But my introduction was when I was on Senator Franken's staff. And incongruously, I ended up with a data protection portfolio really by accident. I joined on Senator Franken's first day in office, and they were dividing up the portfolios. And now it's hilarious, but no one wanted privacy. And so I got stuck with privacy, and I came to love it. One of the reasons I love it is because I came from the world of immigrant rights, of civil rights, of labor rights, where I was used to, dispersed interests going up against a concentrated, powerful set of interests. And I like being on the side of the little guy. And so that suited me. I'd like to think it suited me for privacy, but my real in-depth introduction into AI was with face recognition. We held what I think was one of the first congressional hearings on face recognition. But then when I joined Georgetown, we did a deep dive into how law enforcement was using face recognition. At the time, everyone knew the FBI was very advanced, but people thought the state and local police departments were kind of backwaters. And it turned out those state and local police departments are actually arguably more advanced than the FBI. And half of all Americans were part of a face recognition database in use today. And probably today that number is much larger than it was, almost 10 years ago. And so why am I raising this? Why do I think it's relevant? Because I learned a few things that may start sounding familiar looking at the modern AI ecosystem. First of all, one thing I learned was that if you just look at the names of the companies providing services, it seems like there's a lot of them. It seems like, at the time, there was a company called Face First. There's all sorts of different companies, maybe dozens of companies. But then when you look under the hood, not only 2 or 3 algorithms from 2 or 3 different companies that were powering the overwhelming majority of those systems. And so just from the outset, you saw that what seemed like this highly competitive marketplace was actually extraordinarily concentrated, number one. Number two, one of the shifts in generative AI has been that suddenly, machine learning and neural networks is that they're not hard-coded, right? It's not a human saying, if A, then B, if X, then Y. It's a system that produces an outcome, and oftentimes the people who design the system don't really understand it. And the way I learned this was in a conversation with a guy named Simpson Garfinkel. Does anyone know Simpson? I'm sure, a lot of people in the room do. Actually, only Mark raised his hand, so Mark knows. But at the time, everyone was talking about regulating face templates, which was a file that described your face. And we thought that the key to regulating face recognition was, oh, you got to control the templates. And Simpson said, over coffee, he said, well, you can't do that. And I said, well, why can't we do that? He said, well, how do you know there's systems that have, that every face recognition system has a face template? I said, well, don't they? And he said, I don't know. When you use your brain and you recognize someone, do you think you have a file in your brain that says Cristina Caffarra? And I said, well, yeah, that's a good point. I don't know if I have a file in my brain, if it's a collection of neurons. I don't really know. He said, well, yeah, exactly. And the new systems are built in a way that there's a lot of marketing hype that says, oh, they're neural networks. They don't really function like the brain, but they're more like the brain than the old hard-coded systems of if A, then B, if X, then Y. And so those were two things that started me down this road. And lastly, we saw that the systems were highly biased, despite them being sold as being perfectly unbiased, and we don't see race, etc.
So you touched upon briefly the issue of concentration. We'll get back to it and market structure, because I think this is a topic that animates many in this room. But before getting there, we've had, of course, a lot of hype around AI over the last few months. There was the existential risk.
It's going to kill everybody.
It's going to kill everybody.
Right.
Killer robots.
Right.
And then we've had, of course, a more sober discussion, at least around what you may call catastrophic risk, potentially very big risk, but not existential. So, to just name a few, we heard Christy earlier talk about replacement of labor force, but of course, there's much more than that. There's the exacerbation of discrimination and inequality, supercharging online disinformation, amplification of toxic content, major injury to privacy, and amplifying also massive crisis of human rights online. In this just panopticon,
it's very flowery,
of potentially catastrophic dangers to us as citizens and humans, what do you most directly worry about, and how do you think of it in terms of what, in your position, for example, one could think about doing?
Three things: bias in key decisions around our lives, number one. Number two, hurting new entrants, and this is with an eye towards labor. And number three, entrenching concentrated power. So I'm happy to take those in turn. But the first one on bias, I don't think people appreciate how pervasive these systems are in the major decisions around us. Who is hired, who is fired, what they're paid, who is allowed to stay in the hospital, who has their claim covered. Increasingly, these systems are mediated by automated or semi-automated decision-making systems fueled by what we would call artificial intelligence. And I think that can be highly problematic. And let me give just one concrete example that I think is highly illustrative. So sepsis. Tens of thousands of people die every single year from sepsis. Sepsis is really hard to detect because it presents as much milder conditions. Like, you could have the flu, you could have a cold, or you could have sepsis and be about to die, which is a problem. And so physicians work very hard in hospitals to track sepsis. And there was a team at Duke that came up with an idea to develop a sepsis detection algorithm specifically focused on kids. And mind you, they set out from the very beginning to create a system that would not be biased. And so one of the things they did is they reviewed the peer-reviewed literature, and they saw that we can't use data from billing, because if you just look at who is billed more, you're just going to magically find that the poorer people are healthier, right? Because they are not paying as much money for their healthcare. So they said, we're going to look at clinical data, much harder. HIPAA is involved. Lots of systems are feeding into this. Privacy laws involved, but they did it. And just as so they root out that source of bias, and just as they're about to roll out the system, this researcher says, in their team says, wait a second, it looks like Latino kids are much healthier than everyone else. And they said, well, what? That's strange. Why is that? You might think because of socioeconomic patterns that it's the opposite. And she said, well, I looked at it, and they get diagnosed with sepsis systematically at 1 to 2 hours later than everyone else. And they started looking at that for a second, and then they realized Does anyone know why that might be? Translation. It took, on average, an hour or two for a translator to arrive to that bedside. And so the training data was telling clinicians these kids are healthier, they develop sepsis later, when in reality, no. They just could not communicate with words to allow the system or the doctors to make the diagnosis at a rate 1 to 2 hours later. So why should you care about the story? Let me give you 3 reasons. First of all, it is so hard to detect and stop bias. Okay, even when you are at an academic institution who has as its mission to, or in the project, to identify it, stop it, etc. This thing almost rolled out and a bunch of Latino kids almost got treated later for sepsis than they would have, number one. Number two, the idea that it is up to individuals, private citizens to detect bias, to make the right choices, to flag things is completely bananas. Because there's no way those people sitting in the hospital would have any way to say, oh, clearly this is an AI system that has been, that's bananas. It is clearly incumbent on companies and on the government to address this. Lastly, and this feeds a little bit more to the conversations I know that are going to be had today. The only way this researcher was able to understand and prevent this was by having access to the training data, open access to the training data that was being used. And yet, what you see with a lot of these large foundation models is that, ironically, they are becoming less transparent about the data that is being fed into them with each progressive iteration. Not naming names, but if you go look at these foundation models, you look at the papers being issued around them, and to their credit, most of these companies put out papers, right? The first papers actually go into a lot of detail about the data being fed into the systems. Oh, we used books 1, books 2, books 3, and if those sound innocuous, I urge you to take a look at what those mean. We used, common crawl data. We use this, blah, blah, blah. Now, increasingly, the foundation models say, we used a custom blend of data that we choose for safety reasons not to describe. And so that concerns me from bias perspectives. And I'm happy to talk about the competition side of the coin as well.
We will get there.
Yeah.
One thing that I think was very interesting was your comments recently on the actors and writers strike in Los Angeles around, which was linked to issues of copyright. I'd like to open up that subject because
Sure.
I know it is something that you indeed have written about. You've done an op-ed on the Los Angeles Times. It was influential. Tell us about that and what animated you about that, and how did you see the issues and the potential answers?
Sure. So, Catherine, Sunila, Max get tired of me saying our three priorities are your food, your health, your job. And I think this really gets to the job part of it. So I'm sure people in the room follow the writers and actors strike, but I was particularly struck by the stories about background actors, people we know as extras, where they would describe, these folks don't make a lot of money, but it's a decent way to supplement your income if you live in LA, particularly, if you get your union card. And they would describe getting on the set. And then suddenly, towards the end of filming, these are allegations. I have not investigated them. I don't know if they're true, but they're certainly compelling. They would say, someone would tap me on the shoulder and say, actually, you got to go to that tent over there. They said, well, why do I have to go to that tent? Well, they're going to scan you. What? You're going to scan me? What? I said, well, you got to do a full body scan from 360 degrees, 80 cameras. And actors, some of the actors protested and were told, okay, well, yeah, if you can't do it, you're going to get fired. And some of the stories, some of the allegations were really harrowing. Some of the actors described having to do this nude. But if you know a little bit about the movie industry, you know that a lot of the way that actors get their start is by being extras. So Sylvester Stallone famously was discovered as an actor, as an extra, right? Just being a guy in the background who a producer or director said, who's that guy? I like that guy, right? And so if studios are able to literally map your body, and some of these scans involved full emotion capture, right? Why would they need the living article, right? If later on they can just slot in the file that they captured when this was a 20-something up-and-coming actor, right? And so
what I did in that op-ed, and there's similar claims being made about writers where there was a concern that writers would be asked, for their first script that gets bought, oh, well, actually, we want the rights to everything you've written. We want that to be fed into our proprietary AI. This was one of the concerns they had. And so I think that the gesture I made in the op-ed was saying, antitrust law may have something to say about this. One of the things I most admire about Chair Khan is her looking at our core Section 5 authority and saying, we need to make sure we are doing right by its original purpose, which was a law that was meant to track innovation in industry, both good innovation and innovation in unfair methods of competition, and empowered us to look at situations where a powerful market actor was using that power not to compete on the merits with someone, but to take them off the playing field. And I think that law may have something to say about these scenarios that are being described by actors and writers.
So this is a transition really to competition, which has been an undercurrent in everything you said. We had at the beginning of the morning a very compelling discussion from Sarah and from Max, and a description of the way in which the industry structure is set up. You have layers at which you productize essentially the foundation model algorithm, and then they have the creation of the model. Yeah. And this is, as an economist, the nature of this vertical stack is important, and it is something which needs to drive our intervention, the way in which we think about future regulation. Now, you mentioned also Chair Khan and the fact that the FTC is very focused on unfair methods of competition, Section 5 and so on, which is very much a sentiment that is around, we should use not just new laws, we cannot just think necessarily about new laws, but we need to use the tools that we have on the book.
As they were intended to be used, yes. Absolutely.
So in this mix, now we have an executive order from President Biden, which is wide-ranging, which has attracted attention around the world, but certainly leans quite a lot on the FTC as an enforcement agency with all the panoply of tools that you have. Give us your thoughts about structure and how that will possibly drive the kind of enforcement that you might see happening.
So let me reiterate, I'm speaking just for myself. I can't speak to what my colleagues or the staff thinks, but I had one main reaction to the executive order. And why don't I share that and then say a little bit about how I've been thinking about these things. First was, I read it, and obviously, we don't, Chair Khan, myself, Commissioner Slaughter, we don't report to the president. We're an independent agency, hence the language about encouraging, if it deems appropriate. But I read the order and I said, great, we've pretty much already been thinking about this stuff. I didn't see anything in that order that I don't hear, that I don't think about, or I don't understand us to not be focused on already. And so that was very encouraging. And for me, I've been focused on a few aspects of this. And by the way, I think the president and the team that worked on that deserves great credit for it. The OSTP team, the NEC team, absolute. It's quite a document. I found the UK's the CMA report on foundation models to be quite useful. So what do I think about this stuff? When the president says you should think about it, here's what I've already been thinking about. First is the labor side of it, right? Both in terms of, I'm not a copyright guy, but both of artists, workers, actors. I think it's very interesting that what was happening with actors, because if you look at all the reports about AI and the future job losses about AI, the one thing they say that right now, at least right now, is protected is jobs that require social skills, right? Emotional, social skills. And so how interesting that there's this huge effort to scan everyone's emotions when they're a struggling actor, to study how they move, et cetera. So that's the first focus on AI for me, which is labor. Looking at the more, not theoretical, but broader antitrust concerns. This UK report did a great job, I think, teasing out some of the key pressure points. One of the things it did was tease out the key inputs, right? You need massive compute you need massive quantities of data, you need highly skilled labor, and you need lots and lots and lots of money. And so if you have a scenario, I think Daniel's trying to get your attention. If you have a scenario where only a few companies have access to that compute or have access to that data, that may be bad for competition down the road. And so, and I think in particular, for me, the compute side of it is particularly interesting. I think there are some privacy risks to saying everyone should have access to every bit of data, but I think I'm particularly interested in the cloud side of it. That's one thing. And then the other interesting point they make is, I think that you were getting at, is some of the folks in the space, look, there's 160 foundation models that have been released since 2016, 2018. So it's not like we have few foundation models. But that said, only, what the report said, and I'm not saying it's right or not, but what the report said is a few actors are already have some advantages because they're vertically integrated, right? If you have a foundation model, you need data and compute feeding into that model, right? And then you need platforms and user interfaces that people can kind of interact with. And I'm sure every single person in the room can think about which market actors that have these foundation models, have that data, have that compute, have those user interfaces, have those platforms already. And so I think those are the dynamics that I've been trying to track a little bit.
And so we are, in a way, in a world in which we have already very clearly a vertical structure integrated with key inputs, feeding into a downstream market with application or plugins or what have you, tons of productization. But at the top, you have an increasing level of concentration. And the question there, though, for an enforcer, I'm not asking you to predict what you in particular, the FTC, will do, but what kind of intervention do you see as being? So is it, again, watching out for unfair competition vis-a-vis the downstream? Is it anything to do, for example, with control of agreements and mergers? How do you see the sort of the set of potential enforcement activities?
Here's what I'm most interested in. I am most interested in the basics. So when these systems are being deployed in ways that affect your access to healthcare, your access to prescription medicine, your access to a job, a fair wage, things that relate to safety, and so anything that affects the basics. Because look, if there's an AI system that models how my glasses I'm trying to buy might look on my face, I don't really care. But if it's a system that's deciding what someone's going to get paid, who's going to be fired, who's going to be let go from the hospital earlier than someone else, those are the systems that I at least will be asking the most questions about. Because you're right, you do have to make hard choices as a law enforcement agency about where you investigate, where you look, and what cases to bring.
But at that level, at that level of productization, there is enormous amount of choice and competition because the models are used to meet thousands of user cases. So there needs to be regulation of sorts and watching out for that deployment that doesn't end up being toxic. What I think is also a big question is how do we actually watch the upper layer, the level of concentration, and how it can distort the input into that. Do you think there will be inevitable kind of thinking around this, and how do you see the link between deployment and the upstream concentration?
I'll just say this: when the new models are coming out, I am reading the papers, right? I'm reading what they say about data. I'm reading what they say about compute. I am reading those things. So I can't speak for what other people in the building are doing, but I certainly am trying to get a sense of the leading models, how they work, what goes into them in terms of data, what goes into them in terms of compute, the commercial relationships between the companies behind the models and the companies behind the compute, behind the data, behind the interfaces. That is absolutely of acute interest to me.
Right. I'm going to thank you now because I think we've run out of time. Join me in thanking Alvaro Bedoya for this illuminating conversation. And thank you so much.
Next time it'll be the other way around. I'll be interviewing you. Thank you.